Assalamualaikum. We are from class AS2292A. We'll present a comparison between ISO 9001, ISO 14001, and ISO 45001. For class 4.1, understanding the organization and its context. ISO 9001, ISO 14001, and ISO 45001 have the same purpose, which is the organization should determine the external and internal issues that impact the ability to achieve quality, environmental, and OH&S management system respectively. For class 4.2, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. For ISO 90001, the organization shall determine the interested parties that are relevant to the quality management system and the requirement of these interested parties that relevant to the quality management system. The organization shall monitor and review information about these interested parties and their relevant requirement. For ISO 14001, the organization shall determine the interested parties that are relevant to the environmental management system and relevant needs and expectations, which of these needs and expectations become its compliance obligations. For ISO 45001, the organization shall determine the interested parties of workers that are relevant to OH&S management system, the relevant needs and expectations, which of these needs could become legal requirement and other requirements. For class 4.3, determining the scope of the environmental management system. For ISO 9001, the organization shall consider the internal and external issues, the requirement of relevant interested parties, in understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. The products and services are organizations. The organization shall apply the requirement of international standard if they are applicable within the determined scope of its quality management system. For ISO 14001, the organization shall consider the internal and external issues, the compliance obligations, the organizational units, functions, and physical boundaries, its activities, products, and services, its authority and ability to exercise control and influence. The scope shall be maintained as documented information and available to interested parties. Next, for ISO 45001, the organization shall consider the external and internal issues, the requirement on understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, the plan or perform work-related activities. OH&S management system may include activities, products, and services within the organization's control. Class 4.4, Environmental Management System. For ISO 9001, the organization shall establish, implement, and continually improve the QMS, including the processes needed and their interaction with the requirement of international standard. The organization shall determine the process needed for QMS and the application of organizations. The organization shall maintain documented information to support the operation of the process, retain documented information to have confidence that the processes are carried out as planned. For ISO 14001 and 45001, the organization shall establish, implement, and continually improve the environmental management system or OH&S management system, including the process needed and the interaction of the requirement of international standard.
So next is clause 5, which is leadership, and under leadership there are a few subclauses. So the first one is 5.1, leadership and commitment. For ISO 9001, take the responsibility for the effectiveness of the quality management system. It promotes process approach, promoting a culture of process improvement. For ISO 14001, taking accountability for effectiveness of the environmental management system, ensuring the environmental policy and the objectives are established and are compatible with the strategic direction. And for ISO 45001, take responsibility and accountability for the prevention of work-related injury, ill health, and also the provision of safe and healthy workplace and activities. So, for example, protecting workers from reprisals when reporting incidents or hazards. Secondly, the clause 5.2 policy. So for ISO 9001, there are 5.2.1, which is establishing the quality policy, and 5.2.2, which is communicating the quality policy. For ISO 14001, there are commitments that are required. For example, commitment to the protection of the environment, including prevention of pollution and other specific requirements relevant to the context of organization. And for ISO 45001, there are OHSMS policy, For example, communicators set out the framework for establishing measurable occupational health and safety objectives and targets. For Clause 5.3, Organizational Rules, Responsibilities and Authorities, for ISO 9001, ensuring the promotion of customers' focus throughout the organizations and the integrity of the quality management is maintained when changes to the QMS system are planned and implemented. For ISO 14001, there are requirements of the international standard which are reporting on the performance of the environmental management system and also ensure the EMS is maintained. For ISO 45001, top management should assign the responsibility and authority for ensuring that the OHS management system conforms to the requirements of ISO 45001 and reporting on the performance of the OHS management system to the top management.
In ISO 45001, the organization shall establish, implement, and maintain the process needed to meet the requirement which potential emergency situation, including that have environmental impact. Next, for ISO 9001, it gives assurance that quality management system can achieve. Also enhance desirable effects and prevent or reduce undesired effects and achieve improvement. For ISO 45001, in the planning process shall determine and assess the risks and opportunities that are relevant to the intended outcomes of the OHS management system associated with changes in the organization or the OHS management. For Clause 6.1, the environmental aspect for ISO 40001 shall determine the environmental aspects of its activities, products, and service. For ISO 9001, the organization shall plan how to integrate and implement the actions into its quality management system process. Next, for ISO 45001, the organization shall establish, implement, and maintain a process for hazard identification that is ongoing and proactive, and also assess OHS risk from the identified hazard while taking into account the effectiveness of existing control. The ISO 45001 also determine and assess the other risks related to the establishment, implementation, operation, and maintenance of OHS management system. Next, the subtopic for 6.1.3, which is compliance obligations, and 6.1.4, which is planning action. For ISO 40001, is the organization shall determine and have access to the compliance obligations related to its environmental aspect, and also compliance obligations apply to organization and maintain documented information of its compliance obligations. For planning action, organization shall plan significant environmental aspect, compliance obligations, and risk and opportunity identified. For ISO 45001, the determinations of legal requirements and other requirements. So the organization shall establish, implement, and maintain a process to determine and have access to up-to-date legal requirements, and also how to legal requirements and other requirements, and also shall ensure that it is updated to reflect any changes. For planning action, the organization shall plan actions to address the risk and opportunities and legal requirements and other requirements, and also prepare for and respond to emergency situations. For Clause 6.2, objective and planning to achieve. In ISO 4001, the environmental objective is the organization must take into account the organization's significant environmental and associated compliance obligations and considering its risks and opportunities. Next, planning action to achieve environment objective. The organization shall determine what will be done, what resource will be required, and who will be responsible. For ISO 9001, establish quality objective. The organization shall establish quality objective at relevant function, level, and process needed for the quality management system. The organization shall maintain documented information on the quality objective. For ISO 45001 OHS objective, the organization shall establish OHS objective at relevant functions and levels in order to maintain and continually improve the OHS performance. Planning to achieve OHS objective, the organization shall plan actions to address these risks and opportunity and legal requirement and other requirements, and also prepare for and respond to emergency situations.
Clause 7.1 Resources. For each ISO 19001, 14001, and 45001, the organization shall determine and provide the resources needed for the establishment, implementation, maintenance, and continual improvement for each ISO. And for ISO 19001, the organization also shall consider the capabilities of and constraint on internal resources and what needs to be obtained from external providers. Clause 7.2 Competence. For these three ISO 9001, 14001, and 45001, the organization shall determine the necessary competence of person doing works under its control or the workers that affect the performance of their ISO. And for the second is the organization also need to ensure that these persons or worker are competent of the basis of appropriate education, training or experience. And for the third is where applicable, the organization shall take action to acquire the necessary competence and evaluate the effectiveness of the action taken. And for the ISO 9001, the organization shall retain appropriate documented information as evidence of competence. Also same with the ISO 45001. And for the ISO 14001 Environmental Management System, the organization shall determine training needs associated with its environmental aspects and its environmental management system. Clause 7.3 Awareness. For the ISO 19001, the organization shall ensure that persons doing work under the organization control are aware of the quality policy, relevant quality objective, their contribution to the effectiveness of the QMS, and the implication of not conforming with the QMS requirement. And for the ISO 14001, the organization shall ensure that persons doing work under the organization control are aware of the environmental policy, the significant environmental aspect and related actual or potential environmental impact associated with their work, their contribution to the effectiveness of the EMS, and the implication of not conforming with the QMS requirement. And for the ISO 45001, workers shall be made aware of the OH and S policy and objective, their contribution to the effectiveness of the OH and S management system, implication and potential consequences of not conforming with to the OH and S management system requirement, incident and the outcome of investigation that are relevant to them, hazard OH and S risk and action determined that are relevant to them, and the last is the ability to remove themselves from work situation that they considered presents an imminent and serious danger to their life or health. Clause 7.4 Communication. For the QMS, EMS, and OH and S management system, the organization shall determine or establish, implement, and maintain the process needed for internal or external communication relevant to the QMS or EMS or OH and S management system, including on what it will, when, with whom, how, and who to communicate. And for the ISO 14001 and for the ISO 45001, when establishing its communication process, the organization shall take into account its compliant obligation for EMS, and the legal requirement and other requirement for the OH and S management system. And the next is the organization shall ensure that environmental information communicated is consistent with information generated within the QMS and is reliable. And for the OH and S, the organization shall ensure that OH and S management system information to be communicated is consistent with information generated with the OH and S management system and is reliable. And for both, the organization for the both EMS and OH and S management system, the organization shall respond to relevant communication on its EMS or OH and S management system. And the last is this both ISO, EMS, and OH and S, the organization shall retain documented information as evidence of its communication as appropriate. The internal communication. So internally communicate information relevant to the EMS or OH and S management system among the various levels and functions of the organization. And the second is ensure its communication process enables for the person doing work under the organization control or workers to contribute the continual improvement. And for the external communication, the organization shall externally communicate information relevant to the EMS or the OH and S management system. Clause 7.5 Documented information. For the QMS and EMS, documented information is required by internal standard, while for the OH and S is required by document. And the next point is the documented information for these three QMS, EMS, and OH and S is determined by the organization as being necessary for the effectiveness of these three ISO. And the next is the extent of documented information can differ from one organization to another due to the size of organization and its type of activity, process, product, and services for these three QMS, EMS, and OHS, and the complexity of process and their interaction for these three ISO. And for the QMS, the competence of person. For the EMS, the competence of person we work under the organization's control and the needs to demonstrate fulfillment of compliance obligation. And for the OHS, the competence of worker, the needs to demonstrate fulfillment of legal requirements and other requirements.
In clause 8.1, which is the operational planning and control, as for ISO 9001, the organization need to meet requirements for the provision of products and services and to implement the actions as determined in 6.1, whereas for ISO 14001, it need to meet environmental management system requirements and implement the actions to address risk and opportunity as identified in 6.1. Differ with ISO 45001, the organization need to meet requirements of the OHS management system and to implement the actions determined in clause 6. Next, the planned changes are required to be controlled and action is taken mitigate the effects of unintended consequences of changes as stated in ISO 9001, whereas ISO 14001 state that any planned and unplanned changes should be addressed to ensure that the unintended consequences of these changes do not have a negative effect. Meanwhile, differ with ISO 45001, any requirements for risk assessment, which is operational control, should be determined in form of timely, which is frequency, and regular fashion, and the action and outputs from these functions are undertaken. These three ISOs state the need of processes by the organization to implement the control of the processes in accordance with the criteria. But for ISO 9001, it also states that the controls also need to follow hierarchy, for example, elimination, substitution, and administrative. Plus, it can be used either individually nor in combination. In clause 8.2, there's no clause of 8.2 for ISO 9001, so the comparison is only between ISO 14001 and 45001. Both ISO need the organization to come up with planned response to any emergency situation, and ISO 45001 state it must including the provision of first aid. Next, both ISO state all the planned response must periodically test the planned response actions where practicable. An organization should evaluate its risk of environmental emergencies and evaluate to carry out testing for its procedure. But differ with ISO 45001, it focuses on planning for unexpected events by identification of hazards, highlighted potential emergency situations. Lastly, based on both clauses in 3 ISO, they state the need of the documented information to keep maintained and retained, to have confidence that the processes have been carried out as planned.
For clause 9.1, monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation for ISO 9001, which is evaluate the performance and the effectiveness of the quality management system, retain document information as evidence for the result. For ISO 14001, which is the organization must monitor, measure, analyze, and evaluate the environmental performance, ensure the calibrate or verified monitoring and measurement equipment is used and maintained as appropriate. Communicate relevant environmental performance information both initially and externally as identified in its communication process and as required by its compliance obligation. And lastly, retain appropriate document information as evidence of the monitoring, measurement, analysis, and performance evaluation. And lastly, for ISO 45001, for general, establish, implement, and maintain process for monitoring, measurement, analyze, and performance evaluation. Evaluate the OHS performance. Determine the effectiveness of the OHS management system. Monitoring and measuring equipment is calibrated or verified as appropriate and used and maintained as appropriate. And lastly, retain appropriate document information as evidence of the result of monitoring, measurement, analysis, and performance evaluation, and on the maintenance, calibration, or verification of measuring equipment. For the ISO 9001, which is 9.1.2 customer certification, which monitor the customer precipitation of the degree which their need and expectation have been fulfilled and determine the method of obtaining, monitoring, and using the information. And for ISO 40001, evaluation of compliance, they need to establish, implement, and maintain the process need to fulfill the compliance obligation. Next, maintain knowledge and understanding of the compliance status. And lastly, for ISO 45001, evaluation compliance, establish, implement, and maintaining process for every compliance with legal requirement and other requirement. And lastly, maintain knowledge and understanding of compliance status with legal requirement and other requirement. And for ISO 9001, 9.1.0 analysis evaluation, it must analyze and evaluate appropriate data and information arising from monitoring and measurement. Internal audit for ISO 9001, which is conduct the internal audit at planned interval to provide information whether the quality management system confirm the organization own requirement. And for ISO 40001, for 9.2.1 general, conduct internal audit at planned interval to provide information on whether the environmental management system confirm the requirement. And for ISO 45001, in the general, conduct the internal audit at planned interval that will provide information whether the OH&S management is conforming to the organization owns requirement for OH&S management system, including of OH&S policy and OH&S objective and the requirement of ISO 45001 2018. And for 9.2.2 internal audit program, ensure the result and the audit reportedly to relevant management. Clause 9.3, which is management review for ISO 9001, general review the organization QMS as planned interval to ensure it continuing suitability, adequacy, effectiveness, and it should be aligned with the strategic direction of the organization. And for management review input for ISO 9001, plan and carry out management review considering the status of action from previous management review. Next, change in external and internal issue related to environmental management system. And lastly, change external and external issue related to OH and H management system. 9.3.3 management review output. Review must include institution and action related to opportunity for improvement, any needs for change to QMS and resource and needs. And for ISO 14001, conclusion about the continuing suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of an environmental management system. And lastly, for ISO 45001, the continuing suitability and effectiveness of OH&S management system. And lastly, opportunity to enhance the integration of OH&S management system with other business process. Clause 10.1 general, which for ISO 9001, select opportunity for improvement that will enhance customer satisfaction. And for ISO 14001, determine opportunity for improvement and implement necessary action. And lastly, for ISO 45001, actively seek out and where possible realize opportunity for improvement that will facilitate the achievement of the intended outcome of the OH&S management system. Next, for clause 10.2, which is ISO 9001 and ISO 14001, the same for 10.2, non-conformity and corrective action. And for ISO 45001, 10.2 is incident, conformity, and corrective action. For clause 10.3, continual improvement for ISO 9001, improve the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the quality management system. And for ISO 14001, improve suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of environmental management to enhance environmental performance. And lastly, for ISO 45001, improve the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the OH&S management system by enhance the OH&S performance.